February 2008, Musan County, North Hamgyong Province, northeastern corner of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, 6 kilometers from the Tumen River. The temperature that night was recorded at minus 19 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that makes sound travel differently, sharper, farther, the kind of cold that border guards in that region learn to use as cover because it keeps civilian movement off the streets and reduces the variables they need to monitor. A woman named Yoon Hee-soon, 34 years old, former state textile worker, moves through the back perimeter of a residential block at approximately 3:15 in the morning. She is not running. She is not panicked. She moves at a pace that, to any observer at distance, would read as purposeful but unremarkable. The movement of someone who belongs exactly where they are. She reaches a specific point along the southeastern bank of the Tumen River that she has visited in her mind several hundred times before arriving at it physically. She crosses in just under 9 minutes. On the Chinese side, she walks to a location she was given in a message she memorized and then destroyed. She knocks 3 times. The door opens. That was the last documented moment of Yoon Hee-soon inside North Korean territory. What she did that February morning has a surface simplicity to it that is, in certain ways, misleading. The crossing itself, 9 minutes, a frozen river, a prearranged contact on the other side, is the part of the story that is easiest to describe. It is also the least instructive part of it, because by the time Yoon stepped onto the ice, the difficult work had already been completed. The variables had been reduced. The timeline had been confirmed. The margin for error, which she had spent the better part of a year methodically compressing, had been brought down to a level she had determined was acceptable. This wasn't simply an escape. It was the final output of a planning process that had been running, concealed inside the routines of an ordinary North Korean life, for 11 months. It involved the observation of patrol patterns, the careful cultivation of 2 separate individuals who each possessed one piece of information she needed, and the management of her own visible behavior during that entire period. Her attendance at mandatory community sessions, her relationship with her Inminban unit monitor, to her performance at the textile facility where she was assigned, in a way that produced no detectable signal of what she was actually doing. The system she was operating inside had been designed, at considerable institutional effort, to make exactly that kind of concealment impossible. It was not impossible, and Yoon Hee-soon was not the first person to demonstrate that, nor was she the last. She was one data point inside a phenomenon that has been accumulating data points for more than 30 years, and that the system in question has never fully resolved. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea maintains one of the most extensively documented systems of population control that exists in the contemporary world. The UN Commission of Inquiry, in its 2014 report, dedicated several hundred pages to describing its architecture. The movement permit requirements that govern travel between counties, the Songbun classification system that assigns citizens to loyalty tiers inherited across generations, the Inminban neighborhood monitoring units that operate at the level of individual residential blocks, and the principle of collective punishment that extends legal consequence for a person's actions to their immediate family members, and in some documented cases further. This is the environment inside which people like Yoon Hee-soon make their calculations. And the calculations are made consistently, across administrations, across security intensifications, across years when the consequences for attempting to cross and being caught became demonstrably more severe. When, as of the most recent figures compiled by South Korea's Ministry of Unification, more than 34,000 North Korean defectors have been formally resettled in South Korea. That figure represents only the portion of a larger total who successfully reached a third country willing to process their status. It does not account for those living undocumented inside China. It does not account for those who attempted the crossing and did not complete it. What it does represent is a sustained, documented pattern of individuals finding navigable gaps inside a system that presents itself, and that many outside observers have characterized as effectively sealed. The question this documentary is organized around is not simply whether those gaps exist. The documented record has already answered that. The question is structural. What does it mean that they exist? What does the persistence of successful defection, across decades, across escalating enforcement, across a state apparatus that has demonstrated both the intent and the capacity to impose severe consequences on those who attempt it, reveal about the system itself, about the specific points where comprehensive control and practical implementation diverge, about what happens when an institution's model of human behavior turns out to be, in specific and repeatable ways, incomplete? Yoon Hee-soon's story is one answer to that question, but to understand the answer, you have to start earlier than February 2008. You have to start with who she was before she reached that riverbank, and with what she had learned over 11 months of careful and invisible work, or that the system responsible for monitoring her had not yet learned about her. Yoon Hee-soon was born in 1973 in Musan County, one of the poorest administrative districts in North Hamgyong Province. Musan sits close to the Chinese border, close enough that, on clear days, the outline of structures on the other side of the Tumen River is visible to the naked eye. That proximity is not incidental to her story. It is, in several documented ways, foundational to it. Her father worked at the Musan iron ore complex, the largest open-pit mine in North Korea and one of the primary industrial facilities in the northeastern region. Employment at a state facility of that scale carried a specific Songbun classification, not elite but stable. Her family occupied the middle tier of a system that assigned every North Korean citizen a loyalty ranking inherited from their parents and grandparents, a ranking that determined where they could live, where they could work, what schools their children could attend, and the degree of institutional scrutiny applied to their daily movements. For the first 2 decades of her life, Yoon's profile was, by every visible indicator, unremarkable. She completed her mandatory schooling. She was assigned to the Musan textile facility, a state-operated production unit that processed synthetic fiber for domestic distribution. She attended the mandatory political study sessions held 3 times per week at her work unit. She maintained her relationship with her Iminban monitor, the designated neighborhood supervisor responsible for tracking the daily activities of every household on her residential block, without recorded incident. This is the first thing the documented record establishes about Yoon Hee-soon. She understood from an early age how to be invisible inside the system. The famine changed the operational parameters of daily life in Musan as it did across the northeastern provinces, more severely than in Pyongyang or the central administrative regions. The state distribution system, the public distribution system, which was the primary mechanism through which the government delivered food rations to the civilian population, began contracting in the early 1990s and had effectively collapsed in most rural and semi-industrial areas by 1995. What replaced it, informally and illegally, was the Jangmadang, private markets where goods, food, and eventually information moved outside state channels. Yoon began participating in Jangmadang activity in 1996. This was not unusual. By that point, survival in much of provincial North Korea required engagement with informal markets, and the state's enforcement posture towards small-scale market activity fluctuated between tolerance and periodic crackdown depending on political cycles above the provincial level. What is documented in her later testimony, collected after her resettlement in South Korea, is that her participation in the informal economy gave her access to a network of people who moved information as routinely as they moved goods. She learned through that network that the border was not uniformly monitored, that patrol rotations in certain sectors had gaps, that there were individuals on the Chinese side, brokers, in the language that researchers and defector testimonies use, who coordinated crossings in exchange for payment, and that payment could be arranged through intermediaries who operated inside North Korea. She did not act on this information immediately. That is the second thing the documented record establishes about her. She collected information for a long time before she used it. Between 1996 and 2007, Yoon was detained twice by local security services for Jangmadang-related activity. And the first detention, in 1999, lasted 4 days and resulted in a formal warning entered into her file at the local Ministry of State Security office. The second, in 2004, lasted 11 days and included a period of interrogation focused on her market contacts. She was released without referral to a higher-level detention facility an outcome that, in the structure of the North Korean security system, represented a relatively contained result. Both detentions are significant not because they marked her as a serious threat to the state, but because they gave her direct, experiential knowledge of how the security apparatus processed individuals at her profile level. She learned what questions were asked. She learned what answers produced what outcomes. She learned, in practical terms, which where the system's attention was focused and where it was not. By the time she began planning her crossing in early 2007, Yoon Hee-soon had spent more than a decade accumulating exactly the kind of knowledge that the system assumed she did not have. That assumption was the first institutional error. What the security file on Yoon Hee-soon recorded was a woman who had been caught twice and released twice, a managed case, a known variable. What it did not record was what she had been learning each time the system let her go. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea does not operate a single border security system. It operates several, layered on top of one another, each with a distinct institutional mandate, a distinct chain of command, and a distinct set of procedures for processing the information it collects. Understanding why crossing that border is, under normal circumstances, an undertaking with a very low probability of success requires understanding how those layers interact, and more specifically, what each one is designed to catch. The outermost layer is the Korean People's Army Border Guard units, which maintain physical patrol coverage along the Tumen and Yalu rivers. These units operate in rotating shifts with guard posts positioned at intervals that vary by terrain and assessed risk level. Their primary function is physical interdiction, detecting and stopping movement at the border itself. They are armed. Their rules of engagement, according to multiple defector testimonies and documented accounts reviewed by human rights researchers, permit the use of lethal force against individuals attempting unauthorized crossing. And behind that layer sits the Ministry of State Security, the Bawibu, which operates surveillance and informant networks inside civilian communities. The Bawibu is not primarily a border security organization. Its mandate is broader: the detection and suppression of political dissent, ideological deviation, and unauthorized behavior across all sectors of North Korean society. Its presence at the border region is focused on identifying individuals who are planning to cross before they reach the river, through informant reports, through monitoring of market networks, through the analysis of behavioral changes in individuals flagged by Inminban supervisors. The Inminban system itself is the third layer, and in certain respects the most operationally pervasive. One every residential block in North Korea is assigned a monitor, typically an older woman with no formal security training, whose function is to maintain awareness of the daily activities of every household in her unit. Who came home? Who did not? Who had visitors? Who was absent from mandatory community events? This information flows upward through administrative channels and is available to both local party officials and security services. The combination of these three systems, physical patrol, intelligence surveillance, and community-level monitoring, is what researchers mean when they describe the North Korean border as comprehensively controlled. No single layer is impenetrable, but the overlap between them was designed to ensure that a gap in one layer would be compensated by coverage from another. And in the Musan region specifically, the terrain added additional constraints. The Tumen River at that latitude is narrow, but the approach to the riverbank passes through a restricted zone, a buffer area where civilian presence requires a specific travel permit issued by local security offices. Movement within that zone without documentation is itself a detectable event, because the Inminban monitors in communities adjacent to the buffer zone are specifically instructed to report any resident who appears to be moving toward the restricted area without an accountable reason. The crossing point that Yoon ultimately used had been assessed by the individuals who provided her with route information as one of the lower surveillance sectors in that stretch of the river. Lower surveillance in this context is a relative term. It meant that the patrol interval at that specific point averaged approximately 22 minutes, rather than the 12 to 15 minutes documented at higher priority positions. It meant that the floodlight coverage had a narrow angular gap produced by a fixed installation that had not been repositioned since its original placement. It meant that the Inminban monitor for the residential block closest to that section of the buffer zone was, according to information Yoon had gathered through her market network, consistent in her own routine, in a way that created a predictable window. None of these were large gaps. Together, they were enough. The critical institutional feature of the North Korean border security architecture, the feature that created the conditions Yoon was able to exploit, was not any single vulnerability. It was the assumption built into the system's design that comprehensive coverage at the structural level translated into comprehensive awareness at the operational level. It did not, because the system, like all systems of comparable scale, depended on human implementation. And human implementation, at the level of an underpaid border guard on a rotation at minus 19 degrees Celsius, or an Inman band monitor following a personal routine that had not been audited in years, produced outcomes that the structural design had not fully accounted for. That gap between design and implementation was not unique to Musan. It was, according to the broader defector testimony record, a consistent feature of border security across multiple provinces in multiple decades. Yoon had not designed the gap. She had simply found it. The system's greatest operational assumption was that its own complexity made it unreadable from the inside. Yoon Hee-soon had spent 11 years reading it. In early 2007, Yoon Hee-soon made a decision that she did not communicate to anyone in her immediate environment. She decided to begin gathering systematically the specific information she would need to cross the border. She did not tell her neighbors. She did not tell her colleagues at the textile facility. She did not alter her attendance at political study sessions, her interaction with her Inman bond monitor, or her visible participation in any of the community-level obligations that structured civilian life in Musan. From every external indicator available to the surveillance systems around her, 2007 looked the same as 2006. That was the first and most sustained element of the plan, the maintenance of an unchanged surface profile while the actual work proceeded underneath it. The information she needed fell into four categories. First, the specific topography of the approach to the crossing point she had identified, the buffer zone layout, the road and path network between her residential block and the river, the locations of guard posts visible from civilian accessible areas. Second, the patrol rotation schedule, or as close an approximation of it as could be assembled from secondhand accounts. Third, contact information for a broker on the Chinese side who could receive her at a prearranged location. Fourth, the financial arrangement required to activate that contact. She assembled each category separately, through different sources, as over different time frames. This compartmentalization was deliberate. The individuals who gave her pieces of this information did not know what the other pieces were or who else had provided them. If any one source was later questioned by security services, that source could not describe the full picture because they did not possess it. The topographic information she gathered herself through a series of visits to the outer edge of the buffer zone that she conducted over several months, always with an accountable reason. Visits to a relative whose residence was in the adjacent district, documented through the appropriate permit applications that she filed and received through normal channels. The patrol rotation data came through her Yangmadong network, and from two separate individuals whose own market activity brought them into regular proximity with the border zone. She spoke to each of them in contexts that were not unusual, routine market interactions. And the information arrived embedded in conversations that had other surface content. She did not write any of it down. The broker contact was the most operationally sensitive element. Establishing it required the use of an intermediary, a third individual whose function was to transmit her intent to the Chinese side network and return with confirmation and a location. That intermediary was paid from savings Yoon had accumulated through her market activity over several years. The payment was structured as a commercial transaction for goods, documented in the informal ledger of Yangmadang Exchange in a way that did not distinguish it from ordinary market activity. By October 2007, she had all four categories of information. She then did not move for 4 months. The 4-month pause between completing her information gathering and executing the crossing is one of the most analytically significant elements of her documented account. It was not indecision, it was calibration. During that period, she continued verifying the patrol data, cross-referencing what she had been told against what she could observe from permissible vantage points, checking for any changes in guard post positioning or lighting infrastructure that would alter her margin calculations. She also used that period to observe her Immenbahn monitor with renewed attention, confirming that the personal routine she had been told about was consistent across weeks and seasons. She identified February as the optimal month. The cold reduced ambient civilian movement, which reduced the population of potential witnesses. The ice on the river, which at that time of year had thinned but not broken, would support her wait for a crossing on foot. The 22-minute patrol interval at her chosen point created a window she calculated as sufficient. On the night of February 14, 2008, she left her residence at 2:47 in the morning. She reached the riverbank at 3:09. She crossed in 8 minutes and 40 seconds. She reached the prearranged contact point on the Chinese side at approximately 4:15, when every element performed within its expected parameters. The plan worked not because any single element was extraordinary. It worked because every element had been verified, repeatedly, before she committed to it. The execution was the least uncertain part of the entire operation. Yoon Hee-soon was not reported missing until the morning of February 15th, when her absence from the textile facility's morning attendance was flagged by her unit supervisor. The In-Min-Ban monitor for her residential block reported that she had not been observed leaving the building during normal hours. Her residence was checked at approximately 9 a.m. It was empty. Her personal documents, the internal passport and work unit identification that North Korean citizens are required to maintain, were not present. The local Ministry of State Security office was notified by early afternoon. By that point, Yoon had been inside China for approximately 11 hours. The institutional response that followed her disappearance proceeded along standard protocol for a suspected border crossing. A file was opened at the local Boibu office. Her known contacts, colleagues at the textile facility, individuals identified through her previous detention records, members of her immediate social network, were questioned. Her Jangmadong activity was reviewed. The two individuals who had provided her with patrol rotation information were, according to accounts that emerged later through the defector testimony network, subjected to interrogation, though neither was documented as having been formally charged. The intermediary who had facilitated her broker contact was not identified. The investigation did not produce a capture. This outcome was not unusual. Once a defector reaches the Chinese side and connects with a functioning broker network, the operational timeline shifts in their favor. The route from the Tumen River crossing point to a location outside of immediate Chinese border security jurisdiction, typically involving movement towards southeastern China and eventually to a third country such as Thailand, Laos, or Mongolia, from which South Korean consular assistance can be accessed, takes weeks to months to complete. North Korean security services have limited operational reach inside Chinese territory. And while the two governments maintain a formal repatriation agreement under which China is obligated to return North Koreans detected on its territory, enforcement of that agreement depends on detection. Yoon was not detected. She reached South Korea in late 2008 through a route she has not disclosed in full in her public testimony. She was formally resettled and participated in the standard debriefing process conducted by South Korean intelligence services for all arriving defectors. Her case was subsequently reviewed by researchers at the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, which has compiled testimony from thousands of defectors and uses that testimony to construct analytical models of border security patterns, enforcement practices, and the operational characteristics of the broker network. Her account contributed to a body of evidence documenting specific, recurring gaps in the Musan sector's patrol coverage, gaps that had appeared in other testimonies from different years and different individuals. That is the institutional dimension of her story that extends beyond her individual outcome. The gaps she identified and used were not gaps she created. They were pre-existing features of the system's implementation, produced by the ordinary friction between institutional design and human execution, by under-resourced guard units operating in extreme conditions, by surveillance infrastructure that had not been updated or audited with sufficient regularity, or by community monitoring systems whose effectiveness depended on the consistent performance of individuals who were themselves subject to the same material pressures, food scarcity, cold, fatigue, as every other civilian in the region. Her crossing and the crossings of others who use similar sectors in overlapping timeframes eventually produced a documented response. Testimony from defectors who crossed the Musan region in subsequent years, 2009, 2010, 2011, indicates increased patrol frequency in certain sectors, repositioning of floodlight installations, and intensified questioning of Zhangmadang participants by local security units. The DPRK government has never publicly acknowledged specific security adjustments in response to defection patterns, but the changes described in the testimony record are consistent with an institutional response to identified vulnerabilities. What Yoon Hee-soon's case illustrates, when examined as a case study rather than as a personal narrative, is a dynamic that appears consistently across the documented history of North Korean border crossings: the tension between the system's structural comprehensiveness and its operational limitations. The architecture of control in the DPRK is, by design, extensive. Its documentation in the UN Commission of Inquiry report and in the academic literature on authoritarian governance identifies it as one of the more elaborately constructed systems of population management in the modern record. But extensive architecture and complete operational coverage are not the same thing. The distance between them, the space produced by under-resourced implementation, by human routine, by the ordinary inefficiencies that accumulate inside any institution at scale, is where the documented crossings have consistently occurred. No institution, regardless of its stated purpose or the severity of the consequences it attaches to deviation, operates exactly as its design specifies. The gap between the model and the reality is not a flaw that can be permanently corrected. It is a structural feature of institutional implementation at scale. What changes over time is its location, its size, and the degree to which the people subject to the institution have developed the awareness and the patience to find it. Yoon Hee-soon found it. Others, before and after her, found it in different places along the same river. The system updated. The crossings continued. That continuity is the data point that the architecture by itself cannot explain.